Hi, everyone. Thank you all very much for coming to our Farshaw Collins Reading for Pleasure book club. We'll give you a few minutes just to join and to settle in before we start. Let's go then. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Lucy Courtney, and I'm an editor at Farshaw, where our mission is to make every child a proud reader. So it's really great to have all of you here. Teachers, this one's for you. You may have read in the paper yesterday about the research in the US that proves how children who enjoy reading grow into cleverer, happier teenagers. Well, we've always known this, but it's great that it's finally getting some recognition out in the world. But of course, to enjoy your reading, you've got to find the books that you love, books that will make you think, or books that will make you cry, or books that will make you laugh, or maybe books that will make you do all three at the same time. Which leads me beautifully to our guest today for our Farshaw Collins Reading for Pleasure book club, who can do all of these things and more, plus a host of amazing knowledge about monsters. What a talent we have for you. According to his biography, Ian Mark was born in Scotland, grew up in England, has been to Wales a few times on holiday, and now lives in Northern Ireland, so very international. He shares his house with a number of small furry monsters, otherwise known as cats, and also some children, and he admits to liking them all most of the time. His first book, Monster Hunting for Beginners, which is illustrated by Belgian animator Louis Gibault, published in the summer of 2021, while book two, Monsters Bite Back, landed in hardback in January this year and hits the shops in a lovely shiny blue paperback next week. So readers have been gobbling up this series. You'll see what I did there. And we are absolutely thrilled to have him here with us today to tell us about monsters and mayhem, and maybe a bit about his cats too, if we are very lucky. So do get involved in the chat. Start thinking about any questions that you might like to ask Ian in the end. And now I'm going to go off camera and off mute, and I will hand you over to Ian himself. Thank you very much, Ian. Take it away.
Thank you, Lucy. As Lucy just told you, I'm Ian Mark, and I'm the author of Monster Hunting for Beginners, and the second book in the Monster Hunting series, which is called Monsters Bite Back. And as you can probably tell, these books are about monsters. And specifically, they're about the monsters that Jack meets in the course of his adventures. Now, this is Jack, and Jack is the one who actually tells the story. And my job really is just to write down whatever Jack says. And Jack is mad about monsters, but everyone tells him that they don't exist. And he finds out at the start of the first book that monsters are real when he wakes up one morning to find an ogre in his garden. And that leads him into meeting this next guy in the next slide, into meeting this guy, Stoop. Now, Stoop is a 200-year-old monster hunter who's very grumpy, and all he wants to do is retire. But in order to do that, he has to find someone to take his place. And he decides that Jack is the perfect boy to take over. And he gives Jack the book that you can see in the picture, which is also called Monster Hunting for Beginners. And it lists all the monsters in the world. And whenever a new monster is discovered, the book magically updates to include that new monster. So off they go, and they meet the next character, whose name is Nancy. I was about to call her Lucy, but her name is Nancy.
Lucy if you like.
And she's mad about monsters too. And together they form their own gang in the next picture. And they go off to hunt monsters together. So now you know everything that you need to know to get started. And the only thing left is to tell you some of the monsters that they meet and that they learn about along the way. So we'll start with the one in the next picture. Now, I would ask you to guess what this monster's called, but I don't think you'd ever guess in a million years. This one's actually called a giant fart doodle. And it's so called because it's big and it likes farting and it likes doodling. preferably at the same time. And one thing you might notice is that the giant fart doodle has no mouth. So how, you might wonder, does it eat? And I have to tell you that it eats with a very different part of its body, and I'll leave you to guess what part that is. The next monster I'll show you is this one in the next picture. It's called a zombling. Now, I'm sure you all know what zombies are. Well, this is like a zombie, but it's only the same size as a baby. And in the Dutch edition of Monster Hunting for Beginners, these creatures are actually called zombabies. And I really wish I'd thought of that name myself, because it's a much better name. Now, you might think the baby-sized monsters aren't very scary, but these ones are scary because, like all zombies, what they like best of all is eating brains, preferably your brain. Sadly, the Monster Hunting for Beginners book doesn't have much advice what to do if you ever meet a zombling in the wild, except to say that you should run very fast, preferably away from the zombling and not towards it. But it does say that if you do get caught and have your brain eaten, that you shouldn't worry about it too much, because lots of creatures live very happy lives without brains. For example, in the next picture, starfish, for example, they don't have brains. And also, next picture, PE teachers. They don't have any brains either. So the next picture now. So you've probably worked out by now that my books are not very serious. There are lots of books that can teach you important lessons about the world, and they're all great too. But my books are not like that. Their only purpose really is to make readers laugh or go yuck, like when you find out how a giant fart doodle eats his breakfast, for example, or best of all, to laugh and go yuck at the same time. And that, of course, is the whole point of this book club. It's all about reading for pleasure, for fun. And I know that some of you might not enjoy reading as much as you're told sometimes that you should. You'd rather be playing video games or watching YouTube or doing something else. And that's okay, I understand. I'd rather do some of those things too, rather than write books. But I do hope that my books can be enjoyed by everyone. The children who already love reading, but also others who normally would rather do anything than pick up a book. And I do that by including lots of very, very silly jokes. But of course, when you do read for pleasure, you can't help also learning things at the same time. And what you mostly learn from Monster Hunting for Beginners and Monsters Bite Back is how to go hunting for monsters like Jack and Nancy. But how do you know what is and isn't a monster? That can be tricky. Some monsters are well known, like ogres and dragons and trolls. Others are harder to spot. For example, what about this one in the next picture? Do you think this is a monster? Well, I have to tell you, if you do think this is a monster, you're actually wrong, because this is just what an ant looks like under a microscope. And I think it looks pretty cool, but yes, it's not a monster. So what about the next one? This one I particularly like. And this one's actually a fish. It's called a telescope fish. And I think it's quite sweet, actually. And it looks here as if it's seen something really scary, like a huge pile of homework or a giant fart doodle eating a plate of spaghetti, something like that. But telescope fish actually belong to a group of sea creatures called Gigantura, which are named after a race of giants in Greek legend. So maybe they were once proper monsters too, but just shrank over the years to become tiny. Okay, what about the next one? Now, some of you might think this is the Loch Ness Monster, but you'd be wrong again. It's actually just a branch sticking out of the water in a lake near where I live. I took a picture of it because it did look like a monster for a moment. Though in Monsters Bite Back, Jack does have to go under the water in Scotland to search for a monster very much like this one, although he finds something that wasn't quite what he expected. Okay, an easy one next. What about this? Now you're probably thinking that's just a bird, and you'd be right, it is. This bird makes a very brief appearance in Monsters Bite Back, but hundreds and hundreds of years ago, there was a Roman historian by the name of Suetonius who said that birds were monsters because they had wings, and he thought that was unnatural, which is a bit rude if you ask me. Birds might think we're monsters because we don't have wings, and they might think that's unnatural. And it just goes to show you two things. The first is that you can't believe a word that grown-ups tell you because they talk the biggest load of nonsense most of the time. And the second thing it shows is that, as Jack says in the very first line of Monster Hunting for Beginners, that monster hunting isn't as easy as it looks. And that's why it's best to try reading lots and lots of books about monsters, especially funny ones like Monster Hunting for Beginners and Monsters Bite Back, so that you know what to do if you ever meet one. One of the very first books I ever read, if we can look at the next picture, sorry, was one of my favorite books, and it's called A Dictionary of Fairies. And it's sort of like Monster Hunting for Beginners because it includes lots and lots of lists of monsters. And that was, as I say, one of my favorite books as a child. And I used to read it all the time. And I think that inspired these books, really, because when Jack gets his copy of Monster Hunting for Beginners, he finds that it too contains a list of all his favorite monsters. And the great thing about monsters too is that you can find them anywhere you look around the world, even in your own backyard or places where you live. Because one of the great things about living in Britain is that every corner of the country seems to be jam-packed full of monsters. There was actually a man in the 19th century called Michael Denham, who said that every town and every village and every corner and every lane and every piece of wood was filled with monsters. And he had lists and lists of all of them, some of which I've used in the book, like clabbernappers and old shocks and barguests and things like that. And so, yes, I'll read you the very first chapter of Monster Hunting for Beginners, where it says, "Monster hunting isn't as easy as it looks. I should know. My name's Jack and I'm a monster hunter." I know what you're thinking. That kid can't be a monster hunter. Look at him. He couldn't fight a cold, never mind the sort of bloodthirsty creatures you'd expect to find in the pages of a book rather than in real life. I get that a lot. I'm small for my age. I wear glasses. I'm clumsy. I'm not built for trouble. My hair is too long and is always falling over my eyes at the wrong moment. But it's true. I can prove it. Here is me, I don't know if you can see this, doing battle with a kraken. The kraken is the one on the left. This is me trying to hypnotize a three-headed bogeyman with an eyeball tied to a string of moldy spaghetti. Trust me, you don't want to know all the horrible details. I still have nightmares about it sometimes. And that's how Monster Hunter for Beginners begins. And then it goes back to tell you how Jack became a monster hunter in the first place. And as you can probably tell, the chapter's very short. And that's another thing that we tried to do with this book, was to make the chapters very short and snappy so that you whiz through the book at speed and you never get a chance to get bored because there's always something else happening in the next bit. And as I say, in the first book, Jack goes off to Cornwall to fight some ogres who are led by his Aunt Prudence. And in the second book, Monsters Bite Back, Jack goes off to Scotland, where he's found out there are some creatures called lubbers who live in an old abbey called Muckle Abbey and who are making a nuisance of themselves, as monsters often do. And Jack is called to Scotland to deal with these lubbers. And when he gets there, he finds things are much more complicated than he thought. And he finds lots of different monsters, like ghosts and a creature called the Loch Ness Monster, which is so called because it's like the Loch Ness Monster, but it's a lot smaller. And yes, various other creatures that he finds when he gets there. But in order to find out about it, you'll have to read Monsters Bite Back.
Thank you. We've got lots of lovely questions flooding in. What does the fart doodle do? Any special powers?
It has the ability to fart and doodle at the same time. And I would say, if you don't think that's a special power or superpower, you should try doing it to see if you can do it too, because I think it's probably quite tricky to do. So I think that's a sufficient power in itself. It has the ability to fart and doodle at the same time.
No, I think I would agree. Right, we have Harvey at Parkside, who is curious to know, would you ever create a cat-type monster, given that you live with cat monsters.
Yeah, I love cats, as you know. So yeah, I haven't actually created any cat type monsters, although I was going to include a picture of a cat with horns, and it was part of an old spell from the Middle Ages when if you did a particular kind of spell, you could summon this cat demon and it would grant wishes. And that's pretty cool looking.
That's excellent. So I think my cat actually has horns somewhere buried underneath all her
none
fur.
of my cats can grant wishes. They just expect to be fed and have me clean their litter tray.
Yeah, okay. We have Nite, I apologize if I mispronounced your name, at Parkside. Also would like to know who your favorite monster is.
Well, my favorite monster, there's one in Monsters Bite Back called a red cap, which I'm not sure if I can find it just now, but it's a sort of goblin and it lives in lonely old towers out in the borders of Scotland. And it has iron boots and iron teeth. And it's called red cap because it likes to dye its hats in the blood of its victims. And I actually love this particular monster. And the only way to defeat this monster is by putting it in a bowl of boiling water. But you're not allowed to do that in the monster hunting books. It's a very important rule that they are not allowed to hurt any of the monsters that they find, because monsters have rights too. Monsters have feelings. And just because they're different from us doesn't mean that they're not equally have every right to live in the world like we do.
Okay, well, we have a question in. I think this is a teacher asking it, Wendy Jane Copping. Are the monsters good or evil? Is the question.
Some of them are good, some of them are bad. The ones who tend to be the main protagonists in the book tend to be quite bad because they're the ones who get up to no good and they have to be stopped because they're always trying to take over the world or just generally create mayhem. All monsters like to create mischief, but most of them, I suppose, are fairly harmless. And they're just creatures who live in the wild that we don't really know very much about.
Okay, and then this is another one from Parkside School. We have, how did you get the idea for a monster hunter?
That's an interesting question. Like I say, one of the first books I ever had was all about monsters. So I always had this idea about monsters. And then the very first book that I ever wrote, I think I was about 5 or 6 years old in school. And I wrote a story about a wolf in a town in Italy called Gubbio, who was terrorizing the local sheep and eating them. And then it got fed up of eating the local sheep, so it started eating the people instead. And a man called St. Francis went out to stop the wolf from doing all these terrible things. And he tamed the wolf and he kept the wolf as a pet dog, really, for years and years. And when it died, it was buried in the local churchyard. And funnily enough, when 500 years later, they dug up the local churchyard and they did find the bones of a wolf, proving that the story was true. And I wrote this story. And my teacher at the time, whose name I can't remember, I'm afraid, made it into a book, and she put a cover on it and put my name on the front and gave it to me. And at that moment, I decided I wanted to be a writer, and that's all I ever wanted ever since. So it's thanks to her, really, that I'm a writer. But it did occur to me that when I had this idea years later for a book, it's about a sort of mild-mannered boy who goes out to hunt for monsters, which is exactly the same as the very first story I wrote when I was 6. So I haven't changed much, really. The things I liked when I was 6 are still the things I like now.
Yeah, well, that's hopefully answered your question, Donia. You wanted to know when Ian started writing. So we've got 6 years old, so it's never too soon to start. And did you always want to write for children, Ian, specifically?
Well, this was a strange thing. When I was 6, I decided I was going to be a writer, but it never occurred to me that you would write for other children. I thought you would write for grown-ups when you were a grown-up. And it was only when I got older, and I didn't read very many children's books when I was young. I only started reading them when I was older. And then I just loved them so much that then I realized that writing for children was absolutely the best kind of thing that you can do, because you can have lots of fun, lots of magic and adventure. And so those, because they were my favorite types of books, those are the ones I wanted to write as well.
Fantastic. Now we've got Deacon from, is it St Mary Dean, would like to know what the name of the monster is on the front cover of the first book. Do you know what kind of monster that one is?
I don't know, actually. There's a selection of different monsters. If you can see, there's a silhouette here, and this is an ogre. And the ogres are the main villains in Monsters Bite Back, in Monster Hunting for Beginners. Although they do find out in the course of this story that ogres were the original inhabitants of the island of Britain. And this is actually true. If you go back into old history books, it will tell you that before there were ever any people in Britain, in England, in Wales, in Scotland, or anywhere, there were ogres living here. And we came and we drove out all the ogres and took their land from them. So in a way, we're the monsters. The ogres might think that we're the monsters. And again, that's another reason why you should never be too mean to monsters, because yes, you don't know what their actual purpose is.
So it sounds like Miss Copping is being fired with questions from Bampton. So how do you think of your ideas? Are you inspired by other authors?
I think whenever you read, you just get lots and lots of ideas. If you watch a film, you just get lots and lots of ideas, and then they all jumble up in your head. I often dream ideas as well. Dreaming is my favorite thing in the whole world, even more than eating. I love to dream, and I dream up lots of creatures. The other day I had a dream about a giant beetle that was walking through the woods, and I was trying to film it with my phone, but then it sort of started running at me and I ran away. And it had a little cup with blood, and it was sticking a sort of its proboscis, its nose, long nose in, and sucking up all the blood. And I had that
sounds horrendous.
It was horrendous. But then I found out in the dream that it was actually a new Pokemon. And but I had no idea how the Pokemon had escaped into the real world and was living in the wood near my house. So dreams, other stories, and that's one, if you need to read as many books as possible, because you never know which ones will spark your imagination and give you an idea.
So we've also got questions about what your favorite monster book is, and of your books. I'm guessing this is from Alfie. I can't track down which school you are. Woodfall, I think. Alfie at Woodfall. Which book is your favorite?
My favorite one is, I don't know, I like them all for different reasons. I love in the beginning of stories when you first start to hear about the characters and you find out what they're all about and you get to know about them. So I love beginnings, but then in Monsters Bite Back, you get to find out more about the characters and you find out new monsters and you get to go to new places. And then the next book in the series, which is going to be set in Wales, and this one's set in Scotland, and the first one's set in England, and the next one's going to be set in Wales. That one then becomes your favorite as well, because it's all new. So I like new things.
Yeah, and we've got Junior from St Mary Dean would like to know if you've ever been afraid of monsters.
Don't know if I've ever been afraid of monsters. I'm afraid of ghosts or ghost monsters. I'd be afraid of ghosts. I did see a ghost one time. I was walking home late at night and this weird sort of figure came running across a field towards me, and then it vanished. So I think that was a ghost. That was pretty terrifying. But yes, I think in our lives, we tend not to meet too many monsters, apart from human monsters. Obviously, we meet people who are absolutely horrible, but monsters tend to live where nobody else lives, and they live out in the wild. So unless you go and bother them, they're not going to bother you. So that's my answer.
We have Kenzie. I think I'm losing track of the schools. Are you Parkside, Kenzie? I think you might be. Would like to know if you enjoyed writing at school.
I loved writing at school. I actually loved, when I was at school, I loved doing all the work. And I know that some people might not like doing work. They might like going to school because they meet their friends or they do football and netball or basketball or something, or all those kind of things. I liked going to school because I loved working and doing all the schoolwork, and I even liked homework. So yes, I loved writing, and I used to write all the time. And yes, I often wish that I kept all the things that I wrote at the time, because there's probably have lots of ideas in there that I could now use. But unfortunately, they've all got lost.
Well,
So
I
you
wonder
should
whether Ava Rose,
everything.
sorry, Ava Rose, I think it's you would fall at Ava Rose. I would like to know which is the scariest monster. I wonder if that might be the red cap that you were just telling us about.
Possibly, although there's one in France, in a place in France called Brittany, called the Corrid. And these are, again, a kind of small goblin type creatures. And in that part of France, there are lots of ancient stone circles and standing stones. And the Corrids love to dance around them at night. And it's said that if you're walking home at night and you ever come across one of these Corrids dancing around the standing stones, that they'll force you to dance with them, and then they'll dance you to death. So by the morning, you'll be stone dead. So that's pretty scary.
Wow. Goodness me. So there's a question from Deeksha, I think at Parkside. How long did it take you to write your first book?
Oh, well, yeah, that's a good question, because actually it took me more than 10 years to write it. And that's because I wrote it first and it was just really a very short story. And then I put it away and I didn't do anything with it. And then I kept taking it out and adding bits to it, and it got longer and longer until it became the book that it is now. So yes, it actually took me 10 years to write. And I once worked out that because the book is about 35,000 words long, and that sounds like a lot of words, but actually, if you work it out over 10 years, that's only 9 words a day. So I always say to children, or to anyone really, that if they ever think they would like to write a book, but they don't think they could write one, all they have to do is write 9 words a day. Anyone can write 9 words a day. And then at the end of 10 years, you'll have a book too. So if ever you feel that it's too much and writing a book is something that you couldn't do, just remember that. 9 words a day.
Very good advice. Right, we have Corey from Crownfield Junior would like to know which monster you would like to meet.
Well, I wouldn't like to meet the giant fardu. That's definitely true. That's not something I want to see. There is one in the first book also called the crusted hairy snot nibbler, although it's not crusted, it's not hairy, and it doesn't nibble snot either. And why would you? As it says, snot is disgusting, especially other people's. So I wouldn't like to meet him either. No, I would like to meet him actually. Yes, now I think about it. He has horns that can pick up radio signals from all over the world. And yeah, he's pretty cool. Also, yeah, I can't remember whether I'm supposed to be thinking of monsters I want to meet or monsters I don't want to meet.
Well, just give us both, because I've both questions. Which monsters would you like to meet, and which monsters would you run away from screaming?
Anything that wants to eat you, I think a good rule of thumb is that if you meet anything that wants to eat you, you should run away. And anything that wants to be friendly, you can make friends with it.
That seems like very good advice. Have you ever thought about making books about werewolves? Tristan at St Mary's would like to know.
I haven't, no, although that's a very good idea, and I'll bear it in mind for the future. Does Tristan like werewolves? That's the question.
Well, that's the question. If you were a monster yourself, I like this question. This is from Dee Dee in Crownfield Junior. If you were a monster, which one would you like to be?
Which one would I like to be? Well, I think if you can be anything in life, you should probably be a dragon, because dragons are pretty cool. They can fly, they can breathe fire, and they also sleep for an awful long time, which is, again, as I say, one of my favorite things. So I could spend most of my time just sleeping and dreaming, which is my favorite thing, and then wake up occasionally and go to eat, which is my second favorite thing, and then fly about, which I'm sure must be good fun as well.
Yeah, well, I think that I had a question about, have you ever written any flying monsters? I suppose the dragons sort of hit that button, don't they? Well, lots of really gruesome questions here. Do any of the monsters eat hearts? There's a question.
Well, I'm sure they do. if they gobble you down completely, then they eat everything: hearts, liver, lungs, you name it, little toes. The whole thing gets gobbled down. Hearts are very good for you, I suppose, because they're full of proteins. So even if the monsters do eat hearts, I think we should forgive them for that, because we go to the supermarket to get food to eat, and they can't do that. So they just have to snatch up Oz and eat Oz, really.
Yeah, I think that's fair enough. And then we've got Donya has asked another one. Do you regret putting any monsters in the book?
Oh,
any monsters that you've changed your mind about?
No, I don't think so. That's a good question.
You like them all? Oh, yeah. I've got an excellent question just popped up from Ida for Cranfield Junior. If you could fight any of your monsters, which one would you choose?
Well, the thing about Jack in Monster Hunter for Beginners is that, as he says at the beginning of the book, he doesn't really like fighting too much. But he learns to tackle monsters and to take them on. He gets into all sorts of scrapes, but he's a lot braver than I am. I think I would probably just run away if I ever came face to face with a monster.
That's so probably very sensible.
If I was going to fight any of them, it would have to be a very small one and a not very scary one, so that I could be sure that I wouldn't get eaten.
Mm-hmm. Well, we have Bentley has asked, how did you think of the monsters' names?
Well, that's, as I say, sometimes the names are actually real names of monsters that have appeared in legends. And sometimes I just put funny words together, like the one I mentioned earlier, like the giant fart doodle. That just popped into my head as a very funny name. And also the crusted hairy snot nibbler. So I just put lots of different words together, and words that just sound funny, words like snot and fart and doodle, and just put them all together and see what comes out.
Fantastic. I had a couple of questions about monsters as pets. Would you like a monster as a pet? And would any monsters become pets? Do any monsters ever become pets? Which probably leads us beautifully into your cats.
It does, yes. Would monsters, I think lots of monsters would make nice pets, really. I think every animal, really, all animals started out as wild animals, and then we tamed them. So dogs started out as wolves, and then we brought them into our houses and they became pets. And cats started out living in the wild, and we brought them into our houses, and then they became pets. So I think any animal at all, if you brought it into your house, would eventually just become a nice animal to have for a pet. And that includes monsters too. Although some of them, the ogre in the first book is bigger than Jack's house. So if you were to get an ogre as a pet, you'd have to move into a much bigger house if you were going to do that.
Yeah, very sensible. We have Ben from Cranfield Junior wants to know who drew all of your monsters, so you can tell a bit more about
yes,
your illustrator.
Yes, Louis Gibault is the name of the illustrator. He's fabulously talented illustrator, and actually seeing his illustrations is just as exciting for me as I think it is for readers, because when I write my stories, I never see what the monsters look like in my head. I think only in terms of the words. And so when I see his pictures, it's like for me seeing them for the very first time. And I'm always surprised and excited to see what he's done and what he's made of all these monsters. And his pictures are just so much fun. Yes.
And I think this is the last question in the chat. Do any monsters eat human food?
Oh, I'm afraid so, yes. The ogres in the first book, they love eating humans. But again, maybe we're very tasty. I don't know. I've never eaten a human, but, I've eaten lots of things. And can you really blame them if they do eat us, if we're that tasty? It's probably our own fault for being too tasty.
Oh, now you're coming up with even more exciting questions. We're running out of time. Right, we'll squeeze in 2 more. Have any of your monsters got superpowers? Isla from Cranfield Junior would like to know.
Well, some of them can fly. I suppose flying is a superpower. Some of them have huge strength. That's a superpower as well. That's all I can think of off the top of my head. I'm sure they must have some.
Yeah, we've got a question from Raddy. Do you think you will include ghosts in your next book? Well, we can talk about the ghosts, can't we?
Well, there are ghosts in Monsters Bite Back. 2 very funny ghosts called Mop and Mo, and they're featured. Yes, and I love ghosts, and I do believe in ghosts. I don't actually believe in giant fart doodles. I'm not sure they're real, but ghosts are definitely real. So I included them. And
Okay,
actually, now I think about it, thinking about monsters with special powers as well. There's one in Monsters Bite Back, which is called the Boneless, and it can take on any shape or any form at all. So if you were to meet your best friend in the street coming to school or something, you wouldn't know if it was actually a boneless in the shape of that. And again, I'm afraid they also want to eat us. So
yeah, never be too careful. Then we got Merida from Woodfall. Would like to know, is there a king of monsters?
is there a king of monsters? There's a king of the ogres in book 1, and there's also a queen of the ogres. It's mentioned in book 1. But yes, I don't know if some monsters are very solitary, so they don't have rulers, they don't have kings or queens or prime ministers or anything like that. They live by themselves out in the wild, in caves and so on. But some of them do sometimes get together in order to take over the world, and then they usually have a leader. But often that leader will be one of us. It will be another human who's got the monsters to do what they want, proving again that maybe we're the biggest monsters of all.
And last question from this lovely panel of questions. If you were not an author, what job would you want?
Oh, that's a good question. Yes. Well, one of the things when I was young, I used to read, before I ever started reading children's books, I used to read lots of mystery stories and detective stories. So I'd love to be a detective and to solve murders. And
I think that would be fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Ian, for joining us, telling us all about your lovely books, Monster Hunting for Beginners and Monsters Bite Back. And we have a third book coming called, Ian, you want to tell everyone the big announcement of what our third book is called?
It's called Monster Hunting, Just Add Dragons.
So that will be,
we were talking about all the dragons.
Yeah, that'll be swooping in and setting fire to all of you in May 24. Don't forget, if you wanted to buy Ian's books, there is a discount code where you can get 60% off Monsters Bite Back from the Collins website with a special code. Everything you need is going to be in the chat. Thanks to all of the teachers and schools for bringing you guys into the session. And thanks to you for not being eaten by any monsters and bringing all your really fantastic questions to the event. There is a feedback form in the chat, so do jump on for a few moments if you can and tell us what you enjoyed about our book club. And remember the fact that we gave you at the beginning of our session, kids who enjoy reading are proved to grow into cleverer, happier teenagers. So go and find your perfect book. I know it's out there. There's something out there for everybody. So thank you again, Ian, for entertaining us all.
Thank you very much, Lucy. And thank you to everyone for listening.
That's us. Thanks then.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.